Hello, everybody. I am Amin Zand Vakili. I am a psychiatrist at the Providence VA and Brown University. And today I'm going to talk about a novel approach that we took, linking PTSD symptom severity to brain networks using functional brain imaging. Before I go forward, I'm going to talk a little bit about PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental illness disorder that occurs in a group of people who it is developed in people who are exposed to traumatic events. The lifetime prevalence for a normal civilian person is about 7%, and it's more prevalent in the people who are prone to more trauma and live in situations or work in situations that are associated with more traumatic events. For example, war veterans. So about 14% of veterans of recent American wars develop symptoms of PTSD. And in Vietnam era veterans, the prevalence is also about 15%. The thing about PTSD is very hard to treat, it's very hard to diagnose, and it's associated with a lot of attributes that we associate with poor functioning and poor disability, with general mental illness, and overall with poor quality of life. One thing that I want to emphasize is this diagnosis dilemma with PTSD. And just to kind of clarify, the way that we diagnose PTSD is we ask a certain question. PTSD basically is defined as somebody having symptoms, having a trauma exposure, and then having symptoms from 4 cardinal cluster of symptoms. Patients with PTSD have intrusion type symptoms, so they have flashbacks or nightmares, and they see and re-experience the traumatic event that they face. They have avoidance. They avoid situations and conditions that reminds them of the traumatic event. They have negative cognition and mood symptoms. They overall feel depressed, guilty, and they feel forgetful. They have concentration difficulties. And then they have hyperarousal type symptoms. They get irritable. They get into fights easily. They're hypervigilant. They're always on the watch. And they have an exaggerated startle. What is notable when you look at these symptoms is none of these all of these are subjective symptoms. We cannot measure any of these symptoms, and none of them are biologically rooted. In a sense, the way that we diagnose PTSD is we ask, have you had a trauma in the past? And then we ask, are you having stress symptoms? So these 4 clusters more or less encompass what we call stress response. So this is not a mechanistic understanding of illness. It's basically a diagnosis based on somebody's symptoms. The way that we quantify somebody's PTSD symptom severity is we give them questionnaires. And then each question, for example, the question is, do you have repeated disturbing dreams of the stressful event? And then they give scores from 0 to 4. We just sum these up, and that would give us a measure of somebody's symptom severity. Or we can sum symptoms in each of those symptom clusters, and we can see how severe is somebody's symptoms in each of these clusters. Again, you can note that none of these are objective. The retest validity of these tests is not too high. The goal of the study that we do is we try to link symptom severity in PTSD, this very subjective thing that's based on patient's report, to brain network using machine. And so in order to do that, we use machine learning to statistically predict PTSD symptoms, somebody's scoring those questionnaires, by looking at their functional MRI connectivity. We recorded functional MRI, resting state functional MRI, in 15 adults with PTSD, and then we trained an advanced regression, basically, that I'm going to talk at length about, to predict PTSD symptom severity in this subscale. And so let me just talk about this very important thing called functional connectivity. A lot of what I talk about is based on functional connectivity. Imagine that you have 2 sensors and recording activity of 2 parts of the brain. Doesn't matter what kind of sensors you have. It doesn't matter if it's MRI or if it's EEG or whatnot. And then if you look at this as a time series and look at how this changes over time from each of those sensors, you can basically look at statistical interdependency of any possible pairings of these 2 and quantify it using multiple measures. Pearson correlation is the easy one, but there are other measures that people use. And so if you have 2 sensors whose activity are very interdependent, looking at one, you can predict the other, you can assume that those two sensors, the areas of the brain giving rise to the signal of those two sensors, are somewhat connected functionally. So that's called a functional connectivity. You can have a bunch of sensors, and you can basically draw a map like this, which is functional coupling of every area that you're looking at to every other thing. This heat map, so the red ones are higher interdependency, higher functional connectivity. The blue ones are lower functional connectivity. And from this, you can basically deduct a functional connectivity map of the brain. So if you want to get these functional connectivity maps, run a regression algorithm and calculate a PTSD and predict PTSD symptom severity. You want to link our subjective report of the patients to this objective measure of their brain connectivity. The problem with this approach is looking at this. If you pick 100 regions of the brain and want to look at connections of those 100 regions to each other, you'll have something about 5,000 functional connectivity measures. So this matrix is about 5,000 pixels. And so you want to do this, you want to train this regression in only 50 patients, for example, in our case. So you have too many predictors, here close to 5,000, and too few observations, meaning 50 patients. And this is a known problem. This is a lopsided problem. You always want to have predictors a lot less than your observations, but this is a hard, challenging computational problem. The problem is very similar in what people in machine vision were facing in like 90s and late 80s. They wanted to find face recognition algorithms. And so what the face is, what a picture of a face is, it's basically a K by K matrix of pixels. So the dimensionality of this, the number of predictors, is really high. So imagine that you want to train a computer to categorize a face of a woman and a man and learn that by, let's say, a training sample of 100. You have a lot of pixels in each image, so your dimensionality is really high, but the number of images, the number of observations is pretty low. The number of images that you use to train the computer is pretty low. What people did in machine learning, in face recognition literature back then, was that they used dimensionality reduction algorithms like principal component analysis to basically compress these faces and move into a lower dimensional space. So basically you get these images and you calculate a principal component analysis, you reduce the dimensionality, now you have a space that has less dimensions, and then you use any machine learning algorithm, any classifier that you have on it, and those algorithms tend to work pretty well. Just to make a note, this is how face recognition was done way back then. These days, they use more advanced algorithms, but just for the sake of the argument, this is what they did. And so what we did was the same thing. We got this multidimensional space. We apply the principal component analysis. We reduce its dimensionality. Then we ran our regression to predict PTSD symptom severity. And so if you get this for those, so this is called a scree plot for those who are interested. This is actually how the eigenvalues versus PCA components look like. And so from this, we picked the dimensions in our PCA that represented 90% of the variance in our data. For us, it was 39 dimensions, but that's a side point. And so using this approach, we were able to predict somebody's total PTSD symptom severity, total PCL5 score, by an accuracy of R-square of 0.29, meaning that by just looking at somebody's brain, we could account for about 30% of variance in their symptom severity report. We also ran this separately for cardinal symptom clusters that I told you about. The R-square for intrusion type symptoms and avoidance type symptoms in PTSD was also about 0.3. And we couldn't predict somebody's cognition and mood symptom severities or hyperarousal symptom severities. Just to show you what this looks like, this is a subject reported on the x-axis. You see somebody's reported score of PTSD symptom severity. So this is what the patient has reported us. The score runs between 0 and 80. And this is what we predicted by looking at their brain. Just to note, we did that using prediction using cross-validation, meaning that we left each sample out, we trained the model on the rest, and then use that to predict this one. So this is cross-validated symptom severity prediction. And so one thing you can note is it did pretty well. This is actually the first time that with this level of accuracy, we have connected somebody's very subjective experience of PTSD to changes in brain. And so just we took an odd approach to this. We ran a principal component analysis and then we ran a regression. And the regression, the type of the regression that we ran was special. It's called the regularized regression. I can talk at length about it, but at least for the purpose of time, in the interest of time, I'm going to omit that. So we took a complicated path to make this prediction. And one can argue that you have overtrained the model. So this model could have learned, if this path could have learned any noise that you throw at it. This is just to show that that was not the case. We basically ran a shuffling analysis. We cut the relationship between, we just basically shuffled the brain recordings and the patients and just generated multiple versions of noise. And we tried to train the model to predict noise, and it couldn't predict noise. So it was something specific about our sample, and we were not overtrained. So then the question is, so we trained a computer algorithm that could predict somebody's PTSD symptom severity by looking at the brain. The question is, how did the computer do it? And this is a tricky question because computers have their own minds and they do things their own ways, and how they do it might not be intuitive. With that caveat in mind, this is how the computer did it. So here I have plotted, this is how I plotted the brain. This is right brain, left brain. Each of these dots is a region of the brain, and each of these lines represent connection from one region of the brain to another one. All right? A blue line, meaning that having a connection like this, having strong connections between these two brain regions, was associated with less PTSD symptom severity. And red lines were those which were having a strong connection between these two regions was associated with worse PTSD symptom severity. This star on top are for total symptom severity, and these two on the bottom are for symptom severity in those two domains that were significant, for intrusion and for avoidance. And again, blue is less severe. Blue is associated with less severe, red is associated with more severe. Again, as I told you, computers have their own minds. They solve problems with non-intuitive, messy ways, but you look at this and some insights might come out of this. So for example, this is default mode network, a certain part of the brain that's associated with ruminative thinking. And you can see that a cluster of connections from default mode network project to this area called saliency network. Having this set of connections is associated with less PTSD. One other thing to note is there's a lot more blue and a lot less red, meaning that if you have a brain that has a lot of strong, robust connections, you tend to have less severe symptoms. And if you have very few of those connections, you tend to have higher symptom severity of PTSD. Of course, this result is preliminary. We need to validate it. It's only 50 patients, but we showed that using a machine learning algorithm, pretty basic, we were able to train and predict somebody's PTSD symptom severity by looking at their brain functional connectivity. This was done in a very naturalistic symptom. We didn't select these patients. Whoever came to our clinic who had PTSD, independent of level of treatment that they were in, some of them were in therapy, some of them were taking medications, some of them were right back from combat tour. We included them all. And then we would like to be able to replicate this and then also find out what happened and why we were not able to predict those symptom clusters that we were not able to predict. And ideally, we would like to use an approach similar to this to define new clusters of symptoms, group symptoms together in kind of in a data-driven way instead of how it's currently done, which is basically heuristic and by just based on observation. This work was done at Brown University and Providence VA Medical Center in close collaboration with Dr. Jennifer Barreto, who is a brain imager, and I know some data science and some psychiatry, so she helped me with the brain imaging part. I worked with really great research assistants, Hannah and Emily, and then I did this work I had great mentors when I did this work, and also I was supported by a mentored research award from Advanced CTR from Brown University, and then also Center for Neurorestoration and Neurotechnology at Providence VA. And thank you so much for your attention. And I am actually right on time at about 15 minutes that I promised. Thank you so much. Take care.